Welcome to the LB's, the Lover of Books Author Chat. Now to introduce this fantastic debut novelist. Stacey Swann's debut novel, Olympus, Texas by Doubleday, was a Good Morning America Book Club selection, an Indie Next Pick, and long listed for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. That's huge. Swann holds an MFA from the Texas State University and was a Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. Her writing has appeared in Lit Hub, Electric Literature, Texas Highways, Epoch, and other journals. She splits her time between Austin and Lampasas, Texas. I just want to welcome you here, Stacey. Thanks so much for joining us this Sunday night and during the Oscars. So I think this is a better show anyway. So hey, I'm glad you're here.
It is my pleasure. Yes, the Oscars are, I can't remember the last time I've watched them beginning to end. It's more like I wander in and out of the room as they go on for the 5 hours. So Thanks to everyone for coming to watch this.
Well, we're glad to have you. And I guess I'll just go ahead and get it kicked off. I know in your GMA interview that you said that this book took a really long time to write. I want to first talk to you about that. Tell us how long and why it took so long.
Yes, great question. I first had the idea way back in 2006, and I started working on it, and it was very different back then. It was like very kind of like meta, not very realistic. I was really hitting the myths harder and not bringing in quite as much realism. And I workshopped a little bit of it when I got out to the Stegner program, and because I wasn't far enough into it, I think the workshop really scared me. Like it just made me feel like, oh, I don't even know where I'm going with this, and now I have all these new voices in my head from people's feedback. So I put it away for about a year, and but I kept returning to it. And it was just an idea that wouldn't leave me. And I had only been writing short stories up to that point. So I also was trying to teach myself how to write a novel and how to deal with the many characters that I had decided to put into a single novel. And so it's more, a lot of it is, for a long time, I struggled with writing resistance, where I just like anything sounded better than sitting down to write. But at the same time, I felt like I when I didn't write at all, I wasn't happy either. Something felt like it was missing. So the reason it took so long mostly was because sometimes there were like lots of 3-month breaks, some 6-month breaks, and even a couple of year-long breaks. And then once I got it written, I would say the first draft took about 8 years, I think, which is insane in retrospect. And then a lot of revisions. And then even after I sold the book to Doubleday, even with that editor, we worked for another year or so on even more revisions. So it was a mix of the two, many revisions and a lot of avoiding it.
So in case we have some writers out there, what do you think it was that made you want to avoid writing it? Like, what was the fear or the hesitation?
Yeah, I think, and I teach classes sometimes now on writing resistance, because since I know how painful it is, I like to help other people with it as well. And a lot of time, I mean, sometimes it's just hard, right? Because we're all so busy, especially if you have families, and consuming jobs. But I think a lot of us, if the time is there, we just have these weird buried subconscious beliefs about ourselves sometimes that we haven't really investigated very closely, and they get in the way. And when I talk to students, a lot of times I find that they've had some really impactful moment when they were younger, like either college age or even as a child, where someone basically either told them they weren't very creative or remarked critically about the work, and it just hit them at just the wrong time, and they carried it with them. And for me, I found a lot of mine was about my ambivalence about whether writing was self-indulgent, and maybe I should be doing something that had more of a like concrete impact on the world. Like I thought about going back to school for social work and things like that. And I think that I don't know, I just wasn't giving myself permission to do the thing that I loved most. And I was thinking more about the external world, which is something I continue to unpack with my therapist in a variety of ways.
When did you know that you wanted to be a writer, or when did you first think, oh, I could be a writer?
You know, I think I was always a huge reader, and my mom had us reading super early, and like going to the library was one of the um, most favorite things we would do all week. And I apologize to everyone for the dog barking in the background. I'm watching my sister's dog. My dog is very quiet in the room with me. My sister's dog is barking up a storm. So apologies for that.
No, it brings back those, Remus, and we're just
The dogs are in the room with us.
that's right.
And I'm sorry, now I've forgotten. Could you
Your
repeat the
mom
question?
has you reading a lot at a
Oh,
young age.
yeah. But I like, for whatever reason, and again, probably because something someone told me, I never thought of myself as a really creative kid. So I didn't necessarily think that I could be a writer, but I went to college, and I studied English, and continued to really love books. And then I just, the desire to be a writer never went away, even though my belief in myself was still shaky. And in my 20s, I was going to go back to grad school for something because I didn't want to teach high school, and so my degree wasn't, I needed a little something extra to find a career that I found satisfying. And I decided that if I didn't go back then for an MFA and really give myself 3 years to devote to writing, that I might not ever do it, right? That I might just continue on with a different career. And so once you're surrounded by other writers in those communities, and I was lucky to have a lot of friends that I made in my MFA program. I think that gave me the faith that that's something that really was what I wanted to do with my life.
What you mentioned that, you had this moment when you thought that this might be an idea for the book. What was that? What made you start?
I always, and I think I'm not alone with this, and the other writers in the room may think this sounds familiar, but I get a lot of my good surprise ideas that I don't know where they come from when I'm driving. Also taking a shower or walking, right, are great too. It's like you've got to be doing something else with your body, right, for your mind to kick in. And I think I was driving on Mopac here in Austin, and I think I was thinking about something a friend had said to me. I had a lot of friends that were not from Texas originally, and were annoyed by how much Texans love Texas. We just like have so much state pride, and they were like, "What is up with all you people? And why do you love Texas so much?" And I was thinking about like the myths that we as Texans really kind of buy into, and think about our state and how our state has so many kind of larger than life people in it, from back in history all the way, and Ann Richards, so many people. And I was like, oh, that might be really fun, like to take this idea of Greek mythology, which I was always fascinated in, especially as a kid, and put it on to Texans, who would like to believe that they are Greek gods, basically, in the amount of power they wield. And that's where the idea came from. And I just really like working on story ideas that have a sort of scaffolding where you're kind of like mapping a big metaphor or analogy or something. It feels like a puzzle to me. It feels really fun to work on the details then of like how can I make Hera into a mortal Texas woman, and what would she be like while still feeling like Hera?
Well, I bought in completely. I understand that Texas draw. How many states does Budweiser put a Texas logo on their can? Come on, like it's crazy, and lots of driving in Texas too. So I'm glad, we have that distance there. So you got this idea rolling.
Yeah.
You mentioned your writing group. So I want to go back to that before we dive too deep into the novel. Can you explain how valuable or how useful this tool is for you to get a book out? Because we don't hear too much behind the scenes. So I'd like to just know what it was for you.
Yeah, I really felt instrumental, because I'm 48 now, and I went to grad school in my late 20s. And so, my friends from grad school, I've now known for 20 years. But the writing group kind of came out of grad school. And then I also have other writer friends who don't live in town, but who I exchange work with. And to me, it's just writing can be really lonely. And it's hard, right? Like it's hard for writing to be a way for people to financially support themselves, right? Even the most famous authors we know in America, probably still have a teaching job or some other sort of income. And so just having other people that value it as much as you do, I think is really helpful in not giving up, still feeling a lot of hope in what we're doing. And then for me, like having outside readers, I don't know how anybody can write without getting feedback from other people. My book was improved in so many ways by the feedback that I got from my writer friends.
I know you appreciate them because it is valuable. And this novel is set just west of Houston. So I read in your bio, I told everybody that you split time between Austin and Lampasas, but neither one of those are just west of Houston. So what's your connection to that area? Because I've lived west of Houston, in Houston, and east of Houston. So I'd like to know that background.
You know the area. That's right, because you went to Rice, right? So
Yeah.
you're in Houston proper. Yeah.
Lived in Port Neches. Like I've lived on both sides.
What was the first one you said? You lived
Katy.
Oh yeah, so Katy is very close to the fictional Olympus because it is. So I based it on the area I grew up in. So like I was born near Houston and lived in Houston with my family the first 4 years, but then my parents moved us to Sealy, Texas, which is right on I-10. But we were out in the country, so like the house that I created in the novel doesn't look like the house I grew up in, but I basically put it exactly where my childhood house was. So we grew up right on the Brazos River, in the middle of in the country, and about less than 10 miles from us was a tiny little town called San Philip, or San Felipe. And as Texans always butcher the Spanish pronunciation of all words.
They have to make it their own.
Exactly.
I should say we have to make it our own.
So the town of Olympus proper is like 30% Sealy, Texas, which is, when I grew up, had about 3,000 people in it. Now I think it's about like 5,000 or 6,000. And then San Felipe, which was just like maybe 800 people, is another 30%. And then 30% is purely just kind of fictional, which is a great thing about writing fiction. Is you're like, I would like to put a courthouse in this town. I will make it the county seat, even though neither of those towns are the county seat of Austin County there. So I lived there up until I was 18. And it's just a part. All of my writing before this novel, I would say about 80% of it is all set in that part of Texas too. Like I'm only just now in my late 40s starting to write more about Austin, which I've lived in since the 90s. So clearly those childhood things, I think, really, really just weave into your brain.
Well, I just wanted to point out for everybody that isn't Texan, how Texan this novel really is, because I had so much appreciation. One, that you brought up my Astros, like that is a Southeast Texas staple. And I was a little surprised that Peter was watching the Rangers, because that doesn't really happen in Southeast Texas unless the Astros are playing them. Then we have of course, Dr. Pepper. There's brisket, there's blue bonnets, ranch style beans, which you don't really hear anywhere else. And I'm assuming those Fritos were barbecue Fritos in the novel, because that's the other Texas staple. But especially like phrases like every shade of wrong, things like that just brought me right back to Texas. I appreciated it. Made me feel like I was right there again. So thank you for those little nods. I felt like it was just for me, even though I know
it makes me so happy to hear that, right? Because it was one of the things I most wanted to get right in writing the novel, was that I want people who are from Texas or know Texas well for it to feel like Texas, and not, because I think we get a lot of representations, especially TV and movies, where it's not quite Texas is some strange, either it's cowboys and desolate landscape, or it's just like Alabama, or it's, people get it wrong a lot. So I'm very happy when people think I get it right.
Well, thank you so much for that. But I think what you also did was and this may be because it's from your childhood home, is that you really immersed us into all the senses. So it's not just we're reading it, we're seeing it, we're feeling it, we're hearing it. And, you know, like for instance, we hear the cicadas, we feel the dripping sweat, there's emotions across faces all the times, we can taste the beer. Did you intend going in that you were going to hit all those different types of learners, those types of readers, or is that just how you take in the world?
You know, when I read, it's what draws me in the most to books, right? Like what I love about reading and the reading experience is when I'm so sucked into a book that I even forget I'm reading. And there's something about that sensory imagery that I'm getting, especially like smells and things like that that you might not automatically think of, that really just put me in the world of the novel. So I'm always trying to write the kind of book that I would like to read, because I feel like that's when people create their best work. And so, yeah, I think that's why I gravitate to that.
Well, this wasn't in my notes, but I loved the scene where you said they've had a flash of heat, like the oven door. I don't know, I'm quoting, but when the oven door opened, I was like, yes, I know that. You know, like it's just, it was a feeling, it's heat, it was just perfect. I love those moments. And I agree, that's what sucks me in. But there was an example. I just wanted to give this because I just love this quote. But it isn't really quiet, just a soundscape so familiar to her, it might as well be silence. Frogs all around, the burble of the river, those long scratching sounds of the cicadas and the crickets. I mean, I felt like I was home right then. Like it was just, oh, so gorgeous. It's just loved it.
Thank you so much. And that's really, yeah, it's like embedded. I can still hear it, right? Because that's the sound of, you know, the first, you know, up until I was 18, you just go out on we had a kind of balcony, not like June's, but a different sort of balcony. And if you went out at night, it was so loud, but also so quiet because it's just nature sounds. Yeah, I loved it.
Well, let's go back to Greek mythology now, because you said you had, you know, a love of it as a child, and then you know that it's bigger than Texas, but how did you decide to weave it in to this novel? Like, what was your goal here?
You know, I think part of it, you know, it's like we have these impulses towards things and we only later figure out like why we made those choices. It just sounded good at the time. But I realized in retrospect that part of why it kind of started accumulating as it did, and I wound up focusing on the specific gods I did, is that one of my favorite types of novels are just family sagas, and especially dysfunctional families. Like I just have always loved those books. And so I think in retrospect, that's part of what my brain was doing, was just gathering up all these mythological gods, because they are related in the ways that family, you know, there are daughters and sons and you know, children out of wedlock and all those things. And that's why it kind of took the shape that it did. I think also there was something comforting to me. I was a little scared of writing like how long a novel was, and the idea that I would have bits of plot that I could pull from made it feel somehow like more secure to me. But I got really good advice early in from several people who were like, don't feel like you have to be bounded by just the myths. Feel free to kind of move beyond those, because yeah, it can be hard, right? Like, there's probably like the characters of the gods are you know, what I was adhering to, but there are 3 specific myths stories that I kind of embedded within scenes, and they were the hardest ones to pull off because they were the hardest ones to feel realistic, right? Especially the one, the backstory scene of when March and Vera are revealed at the Christmas parade, which is a riff on Greek mythology when Hephaestus puts like a golden chain over Aphrodite and Mars. And sorry, this will probably really annoy classics majors. I tend to mix the Roman and Greek names all the time in my head.
I'll say Aries instead of Mars. Yeah, I'm with you.
It's just,
that's okay. Keep going. We're good.
And it was like that scene is so, it's like really pushing the edge of believability there. so I liked having those scenes there, but I liked the freedom to kind of go where I wanted outside of those myths and bring in characters outside of myths too. So someone, or Cole as a character didn't exist for a while in the first early kind of half of the first draft. And a friend of mine was like, oh, it'd be really nice if June might have like some kind of potential love interest that was actually outside of mythology. Because, you know, all of, if you look at Hera, all the actual myths involving anyone not Zeus with her don't lend themselves to happy endings. And there's not that many of them either.
I'm glad that the Greek myths could be sort of a blanket for you, like a safety net or comfort, and then you can also shed it when you needed to. So it was, you know, I think the moment for me when, you know, I knew some Greek mythology, I did not study it, but you know, of course you come across it, but the scene at the river. And so if you have not read it, these are spoilers. So just pause and come back. But we're going to talk spoilers from here on out. So at that river scene, you know, and it's about to happen. I literally shut the book and I'm like, oh my gosh, I know this. And so I start looking up the summary of Apollo and Artemis, and I'm like, oh my gosh, is this like I had to stop and take it in, like, oh, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. And so I think that's when I realized you're genius, because it was just so amazing to bring that myth into modern day just crap. I mean, it was like what was happening was like, it was unbelievable, but it gave it purpose through the myth. And so I just was like, oh, it was amazing. So how did you choose which ones you were going to use? Because there are so many that you can pull from.
I know. And even you know, when you look at the myths about Orion, who is the corollary for Ryan in the novel, and there's different, he dies in different ways, depending on, he dies in most of the myths, but in different ways. But, you know, that one was one of the early, like I knew that one pretty early in, and I knew that was going to be one of the pivot points of the whole novel, right? That all of the events kind of lead up to that moment, and then the rest of the plot is them dealing with what happens. And I think that one, it was because it was just unfortunately, it's a really good fit for Texas and other parts of the US as well, right? That there's a real gun culture in Texas. And when you have that kind of culture, there's always going to be accidents, right? Whenever there's any, and so, you know, I grew up knowing people, you know, that had been, you know, that had died accidentally from guns, you know, whether it was just them messing around in someone's house with a gun or actually hunting. And so that, I think, just really hit me, because it was something that it was lived experience, and that it's complicated, right? Like it's complicated, those things about like when things aren't intentional, but, and then of course, Arlo makes it even more complicated, right, than if it was just a simple accident, right? There's a lot of mixed motives going on there. But it felt like a really good fit, because it's something, you know, that we experience, you know, in the US a lot.
Can you talk about, is it Ovid, the intro quotes? How do you say that word?
You know, I say Ovid, but I've heard Ovid too. So.
Okay. I wasn't sure. I've heard it both ways. So
I do not know Latin, unfortunately, so I'm not sure.
I should, having gone to law school, but I don't. Okay, so how did you choose them and why? Because those were very much anchors throughout your novel. So I know he was also exiled, this author. So just explain, because I would love to know more.
You know, it was just when I started getting into this idea, one of the books that I had read, I had only read parts of it, I think, in college and undergrad, was Ovid's Metamorphosis, and so I bought a couple different copies, and started rereading those as just kind of inspiration as I was growing the draft of my novel. And so, yeah, it was just one of those texts that I kind of liked most from Greek mythology. And it was where I was pulling, you know, ideas and details from. And at some point, yeah, I went through and I kind of highlighted all my favorite lines. And then I was finding that some of those just fit really well with some of the chapters. And I was like, oh, that would be really fun And I knew I couldn't, I wasn't skillful enough to pull it off for every chapter. So I was like, what if I just do the origin stories and put them there? And I was a little worried that maybe I was actually worried that both my agent and my editor were going to tell me to cut the origin stories, because there's such a kind of fear of backstory often in publishing, or at least in workshops and stuff, that like if you stop for too long and go into the past, that readers lose the incentive to keep turning the pages. And I really liked those chapters, but I kept waiting for someone to be like, we don't need those, right? We have the family here, we don't need them. But luckily, both my agent and editor were like, no, we love those. We don't need to cut them. But I even wondered if my editor might want to cut the quotes, but she was really supportive of those as well. And yeah, it's, again, I just kind of love like weird structural stuff. So having these little, I don't know, like little, I don't know. I don't even know what noun I would use to describe them, but it just made me happy to find ones that fit.
Well, more people are saying that they loved that it started with that. And I am so glad that you kept the backstories, because it made every character more complex, right? Like you want to hate them, but then you can't now because you know more about them. And I think that's more real life and small town and big family, right? Like you have these moments that you know stuff about that maybe not everybody else does. So I'm glad that they remained. All right, let's talk character names though, because Orion and Ryan, we get it, right?
Yeah, very easy.
Very easy. So how did you come up with your other names, and were there reasons for those?
So Peter came from Jupiter. So Jupiter is Zeus in Roman mythology, and for whatever, and I'm sure it's a linguistic reason, quite often the Roman names evoked better believable Texas names to me than the Greek names. So I often went with those. So June is from Juno, which is the Roman version of Hera, and Arlo actually for a very long time was Paul, which is much closer to Apollo than Arlo is. But Paul and Peter are so close sounding to me, and they're both like really Christian, biblical names. And I found that even as I was writing my draft, I would be writing a scene with Paul or Arlo, and I would accidentally write Peter down. And I was like, oh, if I'm getting confused with that, the reader is really going to have trouble with that. And so I cast around for names for a while, and there was something about Arlo that just felt fitting for the character, and is a little like Apollo, but it's a bit more of a stretch.
But it was very similar to Artie, just like Apollo and Artemis have the same, like that connection. So I thought it was great. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I was glad that came through. And yeah, March is from Mars, and Hap is from Hephaestus, which is also Vulcan and in Roman mythology. And Vera, I was thinking of Venus, the Roman version of Aphrodite.
And then Hap, of course, Hepa. I can't remember. I messed up.
Hephaestus is really a mouthful.
Yeah. We won't go there. But I think that naming those twins closer together was the right decision for me, because there are a ton of characters in this book. And so to keep them straight, you do have to have signifiers for each of them. And I appreciated that.
Yeah, even on the paper, if anybody's got the paperback version, we added a family tree to the beginning, because I was visiting book clubs and so many people were telling me, oh yeah, someone's
thank you, Lauren.
So many people were like, I had to create a cheat sheet of the characters, in the first 40 pages, because there are a lot getting introduced quickly. And I was like, oh, I always love those novels that have the family trees, and I'm always flipping back to them to kind of solidify the characters. So we added that in.
That's why authors, when you're a reader, you know exactly what we want. So we appreciate it.
Exactly.
Let's start with Thea, because she's sort of a more minor character, I feel like, coming in later in the scene. But I love the point that you made, that she hasn't had to forgive herself. So she's so short-tempered and has no patience with her mother. as a teenager. This is a backstory, but yet I found the exact same thing to be true when she was an adult. So where's her, like, talk about that character and what her growth is and her purpose.
Yeah, and I think that she's probably one of the characters that changes the least over the course of the novel. And, I think part of that is because the character growth that does happen for the other family members, part of it's because, they have to change in order to continue to have relationships with their family members, right? Whereas she has opted out, right? And if she never, she loves some members of her family more than others, but she has made her own life with her own family, and can leave when she wants, and can feel like she still has a family, even if she isn't talking to the people back in Olympus. And so what drew me, I think, to Thea is, this is something I feel like I experienced as a teenager, and I see this in my friends now who have kids that are old enough to be teenagers, is that so often daughters are harder on their mothers than their fathers, and there's a lot of complicated reasons for that. And I think part of it is because we see what we don't want to happen to our futures. And so I just was really intrigued with this idea of Thea blaming June so much for something that was much more her father's fault. And even in revisions, we wound up, my editor said it felt more believable if she was still kind of more angry with both characters. In the original version, she had a much closer relationship with her father. And that was mostly because I was thinking about Greek myth, right? And Athena and Zeus are so close. And she actually, in the myth, springs directly from Zeus's head, is not technically even the child of Hera. But that, for believability's sake, and because I think so many readers just have no patience for Peter, and they don't like him at all, and so they'll have even less patience for Thea if she likes him a lot, and they're like, well, this makes no sense.
I believe that there's believability in that, though, right? I mean, I know I struggle with the relationship of my daughter as well because of that, and it seems a more natural, easy relationship with her dad. And so it's just and I think you grow into that relationship with your mother, although she never really did. But I was a little sad when, and you didn't mention it, but I feel like Athena didn't apply to Rice because she withheld that information was withheld. You said she didn't apply locally, which I think would have been my university, and she moved on. So I'm just going to say.
That's a little bit of my own personal bio seeping in there, because I did not apply to Rice because I just wanted to get further away. I had that kind of like small town, like I'm so sick of this tiny town, and I felt like it was it's a very traditional place. It's not a very feminist place, at least at that time. But in retrospect, I'm like, I probably would have been way happier if I had gotten into Rice, if I applied, than I was at UT, because going from a tiny town to that enormous university was really gave me whiplash. So that was a little of my own bio there.
Well, I'm just saying we would have been there at the same time, and it was very feminist area at the time, still is. So just saying, we missed.
I know. I really feel like it was a missed opportunity for me.
No, I'm sure UT is awesome as well. So that's where my daughter wants to go, of course. All right. So let's keep talking about characters, because I want to talk about the deadly sins. To me, those were fascinating. Vera brought up an extremely important part, and really she's able to zone in on their flaws. And so we have Peter's lust, we have June's wrath, Thea's pride, Hap's envy, and then, of course, March covering all of the above. Do you have deadly sins for Artie and Arlo before we go forward? Why were they excluded?
I always think of Artie as one of the kind of more evolved characters in the novel, so I don't really think of that in terms of Artie. It's interesting to think about Arlo. yeah, it wasn't kind of a purposeful leaving them out. It was more like what was going on in the conversation there. And but he's got pride for sure. As as well as, yeah, I need to look at the list, but yeah, Arlo, I love Arlo, but he's got a lot of
He, he
problems.
fits in those categories as well. Can you talk about Vera, because she's such an interesting character as well, and definitely more prominent than Thea, but where is she coming from as a character? Because we all want to hate her at the beginning, right? Like she is
Yeah.
just despicable. And then, but there really is growth there once we get her backstory. So talk about Vera some.
You know, she was the character that changed the most for me as I moved forward in writing the novel. And when I first started, she was just very beautiful and very mean, and those were her traits, and that was what she was bringing to the scene. But I got a part, you know, far enough into the novel that I was like, okay, I've got to give her like a real reason. Not that most people would say what she did was, you know, justified in any way, but I have to give her enough of a reason so that people aren't completely alienated from her. And so I just started thinking about her more and like what, you know, what insights I could get. And just coincidentally, I think novels often, right, they get impacted by what's going on in the culture, whether we're thinking about it or not. So around the time that I was in that part of the draft, it was like a summer that had a series of really awful news stories about rape culture. There was like Stevensville, and then there was a woman in India that was murdered. And it just made me think a little harder about, we always think of physical beauty as being such a positive thing in culture, you know, that it makes your life easier. And I really started thinking about how for women, it's also very dangerous. And that gave me a lot more sympathy for her and why she might have built the sort of walls that she has around people.
Well, and then her realization of the half-cocked smile, I think, did it for me as well, because once that light goes on, she can't turn it off. And then she becomes very bitter, but she's not willing to talk about it. She's not willing to admit that she didn't get it, you know, earlier. I think she felt fooled, you know, and she felt bested at that point. Do you believe Hap's kindness is a gift or a weapon?
You know, it's funny, when I first started writing the novel, like I really viewed his empathy as a positive trait. But as I kind of had to watch, you know, their marriage and think about ways their marriage would be jeopardized, I started seeing things like more from Vera's point of view. So I think that it's that all things in moderation kind of thing, that like in general, kindness and empathy, like we all need more of that. It's why I love books, is because it lets us practice our empathy for so many types of people. But there's always a line, right, where there's too much of a good thing. And I think that's what's happened with Hap. I don't think it's his fault, right? It's what has happened. It's how his personality was shaped as a child growing up. But then once he, you know, has to face what it's done to his marriage, right, he has the opportunity to maybe pull it back a little. But that stuff's so wired in. I think there's only so much we can change as well. So I don't think Hap will ever become a very selfish person.
Well, I do love that Vera confronted him with it, though. If she would have not, it would have, I don't know, there was no room for growth for him. But I will say during his rage, and I don't know if you intended this or if I'm just, you know, pulling too much out like it's an English paper, but when his rage happened and he's in the bathroom and he goes crazy and he hits the sink, which we call a vanity, you know, like he's destroying the vanity, yet he keeps the mirror intact, right? So it's like, it's so symbolic. Like, it just seemed so dramatic and so emotional at the time. And I'm like, oh my gosh, he's killing the vanity, you know? And so
no, I love that. I never consciously thought that, but it so fits. I love, which again is what I love about books, right? Those interpretations that you can find. I love it. I love it.
Well, it was a big moment. I mean, he finally let it all go, right? All right, I'm going to do some rapid fire questions while everybody's getting their questions ready if they want to ask. Don't think too much, just quickly answer. All righty, ready?
Okay. Okay.
All right, gotta get my paper ready. All right. Sweet tea or Dr. Pepper?
Dr. Pepper, I am a bad Texan. I despise sweet tea. I like iced tea with no sugar. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I do like Dr. Pepper.
All right. Astros or Rangers?
Oh, Astros, of course.
Cookies or cookie dough?
Cookie dough.
Spring or fall?
Oh, God, that's tough. I think fall.
Which character is the most culpable?
Arlo, I think.
Most sympathetic?
I would say Artie.
Houston or Austin?
Oh, it's tough. I got to go with Austin, although give me another 5 years and I'll probably change my mind.
Are you a morning or evening writer?
I am a midday writer. My brain does not work first thing in the morning, but after 10, but before 5 is best for me.
Happy or sad endings?
Oh, I love both. I love both.
All right. All right. Thank you. Those were awesome. All right. Does anybody have any questions before I continue going? Because y'all know I can ask a lot of questions. Do raise your hand and we'll get going on those while I wait to see if anybody's going to raise their hand. I'm going to keep going though. All right. Can we talk about the intermittent explosive disorder, though, you know, that you've now given for March?
Yeah.
Talk about that and if, you know, what your thoughts are on it.
So what I was trying to do with March when I was developing him is like, I wanted to make him feel like the god of war, right? This real chaotic force that, you know, can bring a ton of damage with him. But I also wanted him to be sympathetic, and that's a really hard thing to do. And I just started looking up, because I knew he had to have anger problems. I started researching different actual disorders related to anger. And I found that intermittent explosive disorder, and I always like to say in interviews, I want to be clear that like you can definitely have intermittent explosive disorder and not, sorry, I'm going to let my dog out of the room. She has decided she needs to leave. 5 seconds and I will be back.
No problem. Let's see.
Sorry about that. That was her let me out immediately bark. So you can have intermittent explosive disorder and never have these memory lapses like March does, but it felt like a really good way and just something really interesting to explore about like how culpable are we for things that we don't actually remember doing. And so that's where that came from, was just trying to make him feel like a character you could still kind of sympathize with.
Awesome. All right. Looks like we have a question. Melissa, you have a question? Go ahead and ask.
Hey, I actually kind of have a couple questions. I have my big Texas hair going. And I'm not from Texas. Sorry.
I love it. Great big hair.
But first, just real quick, I love the cover of this. It was gorgeous. Did you have any input on that? And then second, you kind of touched on how you were able to keep the quotes beforehand, but was there like you had some really great scenes, especially with Vera, man, she was punching some stuff out there. Did you have any scenes that you had to cut that you were just so sad about that you would like to share?
That's a great question. Yeah, Vera was the one, in some ways, the easiest to write, right? If I brought her into a scene, I knew the scene would almost write itself because she's just such a great character to follow. She, to me, is so much fun. The ones I loved the most that my editor had requested that I cut, I just kept tweaking in the hopes that she would eventually change her mind. So I'd send her the new version. It would be that for some reason there's a scene where Arlo shows up, marches at the gastropub, and Arlo shows up there and is kind of confessing like what's happened and what he's done. Lee, my brilliant editor, she kept saying like, I don't think we learned anything new here, but there was just something about that scene and the interaction between the two of them that I love so much that I just kept it. I cut it shorter, and then for a long, the scene where we get Laurel and Arlo closer to the end, where she kind of explains, like how it felt having his attention. She kept wanting to cut that. And so I kept writing new and different versions, and just tweaking it a little bit. And that one I was successful, because by the end she was like, this is one of my favorite scenes, and like had no memory that she had told me to cut it. So I was like, I have done my job with that. So and a lot of stuff did get cut and combined, but they were all things that went, I was like, okay, she's right, I don't really need that. And yeah, I feel really lucky about the cover. I think it's really beautiful, and they let me put together like a document of covers I liked. They asked, like, do you like photographs or more like graphic images? And for whatever reason, I prefer the graphic images on covers. And then they found this illustrator, Ping Zhu, and sent me examples of her work. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. I had already seen her stuff in the New Yorker before. So yes, it was all wonderful. And all I told them, I gave them like a list of things I definitely didn't want on the cover. And like, I feel like 80% of Southern and Texas novels, they put a trailer on the front cover, whether there's a trailer in the book or not. And I was like, no trailers. I know that there's a travel trailer within the novel, but no trailers on the cover.
That's great.
That's funny.
Thanks, Melissa. Great question.
Thank you.
All right. Looks like we have Lauren, and I'm going to pull her up, and she has a question. Go ahead, Lauren.
Hey, Lauren.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. I have a couple questions too. So we kind of talked about this right at the beginning, but your book is very grounded in that, small town, like blue collar American culture. So what are unique aspects to Texas specifically that made you want to tie in that Greek mythology? Is it just because of the hometown aspect, or were there other things that you thought blended well with Greek mythology?
That's a great question. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff floating around in my head. And I do, and I like that you kind of describe it as more blue collar. Like I feel like when you grow up in a small town in a rural area, like you experience class differently, because everybody knows, there is no separation. Your friends come from all different economic backgrounds, and in a sense, it's hard to come from a rural place and ever be viewed as like, the more elite class. And so probably the rebellious part of my brain thought there was something really fun about taking this thing that is looked at as working class more often and kind of elevating it up to the mythology level.
Okay, awesome. And then there's a lot of betrayal and failure within the Briscoe family. So throughout the course of the novel, we see that there's a lot of paths of forgiveness that a lot of characters try to give other characters, or want to be able to start to give them. Do you think between two characters or between a certain marriage, there is a relationship that seems most likely to be repaired?
Yeah, it's funny, it changed when for a long time in the first draft, I didn't think that Hap and Vera, that there would be a definite divorce at the end, and that there would have to be for him to have any sort of relationship with his brother. But by the time I finished the book, I think they're the couple I think that's most likely to be able to forge like a strong relationship. I would like to think that eventually Artie and Arlo, will be close again, but I think that that's something that's going to take a long time for the characters. And in that my editor, actually, I think it was a good note she gave me, the original version of the ending was a bit more ambivalent with Peter and June. Like I left the door open so that actually she might return to Peter, and my editor was like, no reader is going to want her to stay with Peter. They're like, they don't want that. They want her either by herself or with Cole. And so I kind of shut that door more firmly at the end. But I was just thinking, man, when you're with someone that long, you just don't know what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, because I know especially the bit that we talked about with Vera, these kind of flippant comments that kind of like flip that switch in her head. Originally, I had always thought it would be Hap and Vera that would, you know, repair their relationship the fastest, especially since they have a child already. But like that was a huge plot twist for me. Like when she went through that realization, that was huge. That was like the best part of the novel for me. So for me, that kind of like that took like 3 steps back in their relationship for me.
Yeah, definitely. I'm so glad that you like that part.
Thanks, Lauren, so much. Great questions. I agree with that. I mean, to me, it gave her a lot more power and a lot more, I don't know, like more leverage, because before she just seemed like the evil character, and now she's on, you know, solid footing with them. All right, Amy, we have another question. Go for it.
I had 2 questions. One's very quick, and then one maybe is a little longer. So we talked a little bit about the cover design, which is beautiful, but the paperback edition has such a different cover, which is also really interesting. In fact, I have the hardback, but I think I might have to buy the paperback too to have both. Do you have a preference?
I really like them both, but the hardback is my favorite. The paperback one was a specific marketing conversation. They felt like that because people keep thinking that the kind of Greek and myth retellings and things related to mythology is not going to be as hot anymore, and yet it keeps being really popular. And so they thought like, oh, you know, people who love Madeline Miller may not have even realized that Olympus has mythology within it. Why don't we give it a cover that even if you saw it out of the corner of your eye, you might think, oh, that looks mythological. But I adore the 2 little dogs on the red cover.
That is my favorite part too.
Yes, so cute. And so that, yeah, they're my second favorite. Funnily, the first idea for the hardback that my editor and the cover designer had was that they were gonna hire someone who did pet portraits, like an artist that specialized in pet portraits, and commission them to do a like double mastiff painting, and have that as the cover, and which I was totally into. But then sales and marketing was like, no, the book is not about the dogs. They do not need to be on the cover. So, and there's some parallel universe where I have a pet portraiture on my cover.
I like thinking about that. Do you have a big dog or a little dog?
I have a medium-sized dog. So Dottie's like, she's like the size of a lab, but she's very hairy. She looks kind of like a border collie. But my sister and I, when I came to college and I was living with my sister, we got a Great Dane. So I've always had a real affection for very large dogs, but I've never had a mastiff.
They were definitely a highlight of the book. But that was supposed to be my small question. My other question was that well, it's more of like an observation that I hoped you could speak to. It was interesting to me that so many characters thought being vulnerable and compassionate was weak. Mm-hmm. Vera thought it was when Hap. So many people thought it was when Ryan. I know we didn't get much of Ryan, but he certainly was a very sweet character to Artie, and that seemed to be something that people didn't really respect, and it was something that June didn't really like either. She seemed to really think weakness was unforgivable. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thread throughout the book. So I just hope maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel, and again, it's like one of those areas where like, oh, culture's changing kind of rapidly in this wonderful way now. But like the Texas I grew up in, and like the way that my parents were raised and they raised me was like very stoic. It was like, you don't complain about stuff, you don't show anything, you just repress it and you keep on going. And I think it ties into toxic masculinity as well, right? Like this is, so often why men are really unhappy, because they're not allowed to show what are just human emotions. And so, yeah, so I think that crept into the book in those ways, because I am, I feel like it took me a long time to realize that, it takes a lot more bravery to be vulnerable than it does to be stoic.
Yeah, I agree. Amy, great questions. Thanks so much
Yeah.
for asking those. All right, we are getting very close to the end. I do have I have like a ton more questions, but I know you have a limited amount of time. So I will ask just a couple things. The GMA interview mentioned that there might be some sort of movie. Is there any information you can tell us that we can bite on?
The saga of the Hollywood movie options, man. So a film production company picked it up, and then nothing happened. And then they re-upped the option for another 18 months, and then nothing happened. And then really recently, that same production company has pivoted to thinking it is better suited to be a TV show, or at least a limited series, something that maybe, is like 8 episodes long. And so they're currently repackaging it as that, and they're going to take it to the streaming services to see if anybody will bite for a TV show. So they said it would happen early in 2023. So nothing's happened yet, which I don't know if that means they still haven't taken it out, or if it's bad news coming my way. So it's I just try and be really grateful that I've gotten some money for absolutely no reason so far. Nothing.
Hey, that's a win-win. Lauren agrees. We all kind of are hoping that this does happen, though. Do you want to be involved, or do you want to like hand it off and just take the money, or do you want to be, like, I think they want to know, like, do you want to have input on script? Lauren asked.
I totally would be open to that. It's this weird thing where right now in Hollywood, if you sell it as film rights, they really don't want you to have anything to do with the script. But if you sell it for TV rights, then quite often your agent gets you like written in the contract that you get to be involved in the script. But because mine started as film, my contract doesn't have that. So I would be very open if it did sell, if they were like, would you like to be in the writer's room? I'd be like, yes, that would be lovely. But there is part of me that's like, I really should just focus on the next book and not get distracted, because I would like to finish the second book.
Well, that's a great segue, because we want to know what the second book is.
It's I think I'm about halfway into it, and it is set in Austin, and it kind of, the idea came from 2 things. One was I really love noir, like noir novels and movies. I was big, for those that like Texas authors, I was a huge Jim Thompson fan in my 20s. He wrote The Killer Inside Me and some other very depraved noir novels, and like Raymond Chandler and those kind of people. So I was thinking about that, but I also have I've gotten a lot more into politics since 2016. I used to be more apolitical and cynical, just about politics. And then I realized, well, cynicism is a form of privilege, right? Because when things impact people, you don't get to be cynical. So I'm just really fascinated about how we all kind of walk around thinking we're good people, even though we look at other people and think, how are you doing these horrible things? So I'm trying to fuse Texas politics with a bit of a mystery. And it's about a woman who, back when she was dating her boyfriend, he went missing and she helped find him. They've been broken up now for like 7 years. And he goes missing again, and he's a political lobbyist. And his best friend tries to get her to help find him again. So that's the kind of outlines of the novel.
Great. Sounds great. Now, do you have any time to read books? Because I know we're over, but like, are you reading? Like, can you recommend something that you've read or is coming up for us? We would love to.
Yeah, so I am, I'm not reading as much as I like. And when I am reading, it's like kind of around the new novel, but I like audiobooks a lot. And I am currently a little more than halfway through Rebecca Mackay's I Have Some Questions for You. And I am loving it. It's kind of marketed as a mystery, but why I'm loving it is it's because it's really trying to tackle all these questions around like the Me Too movement and the shifts in how we view people's culpability for things in really nuanced ways, right? Like like it's not like she's railing against, the evils of cancel culture, but she is also exploring like how jarring it is, especially for those of us like in our 40s, right? That all these things that happened to us when we were younger that we rationalized and thought were fine were actually not fine, right? And so anyway, it's just she handles it with such intelligence, and the language is beautiful, and I highly recommend it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. And I appreciate you being here tonight, because like I had pages, I could just keep going and going. So I will let you off the hook so that you can actually get some sleep. But thank you, Stacey. Thank you, all you readers out there, for joining. Please make sure you check out her website, follow her on Instagram for the news. Everyone, if you can follow the LBs, the Lover of Books, on Facebook, Bookstagram. I'm here for reviews, recommendations, and of course, more author chats. On Sunday, March 26th at 8 p.m., I'm hosting Julie Clark for her book, The Lies I Tell, a twisted domestic thriller that dives deep into the psyches and motivations of two women and their unwavering quest to seek justice for the past and rewrite the future. And then 1 week later, Fellowship Point, which is longer, so you might want to start it a little bit sooner. But for The Lies I Tell, Laura Dave, who wrote The Last Thing He Told Me, which is also a series that is coming up, so maybe you might want to talk to her. Julie Clark has done it again, taking you straight into the collision course of two dynamic, complicated women. So I'm really excited to talk to her. I want to thank Mike in the background there for running everything behind the scenes. If you know of an author that you would like to chat with, please let me know. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'll try to have this recording up soon. And I just can't wait to talk again to the next author. And Stacey, you were a delight. Like, thank you for answering all our questions. We loved it.
This was so much fun. You asked such wonderful questions. Everybody asked such wonderful questions. It's just, there's nothing better than talking to people who've read the book and enjoyed it in some way. So thank you for inviting me.
We'll be following up and after the next book, and hopefully we'll get to chat to you again then, and good luck writing.
I would love that. Thank y'all so much. Y'all have a good night.
Everybody have a good night. Bye, everybody.